She only wanted to withdraw a little grocery money on a quiet autumn evening. But when two strangers closed in, blocking her escape, the street was empty, or so she thought. Half a block away, her husband, a retired Marine, was heading home, unaware of the danger. What happened next wasn't luck. It was instinct, decades in the making. In a single stride, everything changed. This is a story of how one man's quiet vigilance turned an ordinary night into a moment his wife would never forget, and how, even after all these years, he still stands ready to protect her without hesitation. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. Margaret's shoes tapped lightly against the pavement as she made her way down Pine Street, her pace unhurried but steady. The air had that particular bite only early autumn evenings could bring, a mixture of cool dampness from fallen leaves and the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys. The street was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that carried both comfort and unease. Pine Street wasn't the busiest stretch in town, but on most evenings, there would be at least a couple of cars rolling by or someone walking their dog. Tonight, though, it felt as though the entire block had been paused, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the rhythm of her footsteps. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather purse, the same one she carried for years, its handles molded to the shape of her hand from decades of use. Inside, tucked into a zippered pouch, was a slip of paper on which she had written the exact amount she planned to withdraw. Margaret was never careless with money. She knew to the dollar what she needed for groceries, the small household bills, and the little treat she allowed herself each month, a jar of honey from the Saturday market. The glow of the ATM screen ahead seemed almost out of place in the stillness. It hummed softly, a mechanical heartbeat against the silence. She glanced over her shoulder, not out of paranoia but out of habit, and found the sidewalk behind her empty. The bank itself was dark, except for the illuminated vestibule where the machine stood waiting. She stepped inside, letting the glass door swing shut behind her with a faint click. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow that flattened the warmth out of her reflection in the glass wall. Her fingers, stiffened slightly from the chill, slid the card into the slot. The familiar beeps guided her through the motions. Enter the PIN, select withdrawal, confirm the amount. It was a routine she could have done blindfolded, though she took her time, careful not to press the wrong button. Through the glass, she could see the empty street beyond, the lamppost across the road flickering in irregular pulses. As she waited for the machine to dispense her cash, a breeze funneled through the vestibule when the outer door opened briefly. She glanced toward it, but no one entered. It must have been the wind catching the handle. Still, her eyes lingered on the shadowed outline of the bus shelter across the street. There was movement there, two figures partially obscured by the advertisement board. She told herself it was nothing unusual. People waited for buses at all hours, but something about the way they stood caught her attention. They weren't shifting their weight the way bored commuters did. They were still facing the bank, the machine word, spitting the bills into the dispenser tray. Margaret gathered them quickly, sliding the notes into her purse and zipping it shut with practiced precision. The paper felt warm from the machine, a small contrast to the cold air outside. She pocketed her receipt without looking at it. Her eyes flicked again toward the shelter. The two figures hadn't moved, though now she could see the faint glint of light catching on one man's watch as he shifted his arm. She stepped toward the glass door, her reflection merging briefly with theirs in the background. It struck her that the street's usual soundtrack, the occasional car, a conversation drifting from a doorway, was missing entirely. All she could hear was the dull hum of the light above her and the faint rush of blood in her own ears. She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and the evening air swept in, cool and crisp against her cheeks. Margaret started down the sidewalk, her purse held close to her side. She didn't walk faster, not yet, but she kept her senses tuned to the space behind her. The first few steps were uninterrupted, the only sound the steady tap of her shoes and the faint rustle of leaves along the curb. Then, somewhere behind her, the muted thump of a footstep met the pavement. She glanced sideways, pretending to admire the display in the darkened shop window she passed. In the reflection, The two men were no longer by the bus shelter. They were moving, not quickly, but with a deliberate slowness, as if they didn't want their approach to look like an approach at all. Her heart tightened in her chest, not with panic, but with the kind of focused awareness she hadn't felt in years. She turned her eyes forward, the distance to the next intersection suddenly feeling much longer than it had on the way there. Ahead, the lamplight pooled in a golden circle on the pavement, just shy of where the shadows thickened again. Margaret stepped into the light, the warmth of it on her shoulders at odds with the coldness in her stomach. She could hear the men's voices now, low and indistinct, but she knew without needing to turn that they were closing the gap. The evening that had begun as just another errand was shifting into something else entirely, and Pine Street's unusual emptiness was no longer a curiosity. It was a fact she could not afford to forget. Margaret adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder, the leather soft and pliant from decades of use. It was a deep brown, darkened further by time and weather, and carried a faint scent of the cedar chest she stored it in during the summer months. The purse had been a gift from Daniel on their 10th wedding anniversary, bought during a shore leave visit to a small shop in Okinawa. It had traveled with her through every stage of her life since school meetings, church gatherings, afternoons at the market. The brass clasp, once shiny, now bore the patina of years, and the edges of the strap were frayed in places, but had never failed her. Inside, its compartments held the rhythm of her routine, the folded grocery list written in neat, looping script, a packet of tissues, a tube of hand cream, and a small zippered pouch containing her cash for the week. She never carried more than she intended to spend. That evening, the pouch held $60, counted and recounted at her kitchen table before she left the house. 50 for groceries, 10 for incidentals. She liked the clarity of cash. It kept her grounded in a way numbers on a bank statement never could. Coins, separated into their own pocket, clinked softly when she moved, a faint soundtrack to her measured steps down Pine Street. She could have used her debit card at the grocery store directly, but the habit of withdrawing her week's money from the ATM was a ritual, one she kept even when others said it was old-fashioned. The cool air threaded through her coat, making her pull it tighter. She could feel the purse's weight against her hip, a familiar presence that made her feel organized and in control. In the early years of marriage, that purse had held baby bottles, Band-Aids, and little toy cars to keep the children occupied while she ran errands. Later, it carried letters from Daniel when he was overseas, carefully folded and read until the creases began to wear through. These days, it carried less in quantity but more in memory. Margaret turned the corner toward the bank, her shoes clicking on the sidewalk, each sound sharp against the quiet of the evening. The street was nearly deserted, with only the faint buzz of a street lamp and the occasional rush of wind moving the brittle leaves along the curb. She glanced in the darkened shop windows as she passed, the displays inside static and unmoving after closing hours. Her reflection followed her in the glass, slender, gray hair neatly pinned, posture still upright despite the years. The purse hung at her side like a shadow that had chosen to stay close. She could hear her own breathing more clearly than usual, the sound amplified by the stillness around her. The bank sign glowed faintly ahead, casting a muted halo over the sidewalk. She had walked the same stretch hundreds of times, always with the same sense of purpose. But tonight, something felt different. The quiet wasn't the usual evening calm. It felt hollow, as if the town had pulled back and left her walking through the shell of it. Her mind flickered briefly to Daniel. He had taken a longer way home from the VFW, as he often did, saying it gave him time to walk the day off before coming in for the night. They rarely coordinated their routes unless the weather was bad, and she hadn't expected to see him until she was already home with the groceries put away. She pictured him in his well-worn Marine Corps jacket, hands tucked into the pockets, scanning the sidewalk ahead out of habit more than caution. Even now, years out of service, he moved with the alertness of someone who had learned to assess his surroundings without thinking. Margaret's fingers tightened on the purse strap, the movement instinctive, as though she were testing its security against her shoulder. The zipper on the inner pouch was drawn shut. She always checked it before leaving the bank, even though she knew the cash inside was still neatly folded from when she put it there earlier. $60. Grocery money. A simple errand, the kind she had run for as long as she could remember. Up ahead, the ATM's pale light shone against the darkened glass walls of the bank's small vestibule. She felt the familiar pull toward it, the same way a person feels drawn to the warm glow of a porch light at night. This was supposed to be just another piece of her routine. Withdraw the cash, tuck it away, walk home. But as she drew closer, she was aware of the subtle shift in the air, a prickle along her skin that had nothing to do with the temperature. Somewhere behind her, the faintest echo of footsteps reached her ears. It could have been anyone. It could have been no one. Still, her grip on the purse tightened again, and she felt its weight not just against her hip, but in the center of her chest, where the day's quiet confidence began to hollow into something sharper. Across the street, beneath the dim flicker of a worn-out street lamp, two young men stood shoulder to shoulder against the side of the bus shelter. The plexiglass walls behind them were scratched with years of graffiti, and an outdated transit map curled at the edges inside its frame. Their hoods were pulled up despite the weather being only cool, the brims casting shadows over their eyes. Margaret noticed them without turning her head, the way one learns to notice things when moving through public spaces alone. Her gaze stayed on the path ahead, but a part of her attention locked onto their stillness. They weren't doing what people waiting for buses usually did. There was no shifting of weight from foot to foot, no checking of watches or phones, no quick glances down the street for headlights. They just stood there, bodies angled slightly toward her side of the road, their hands tucked deep into the front pockets of their hoodies. The smaller one, his build wiry, leaned with one shoulder pressed to the shelter's wall, his sneaker tapping idly against the pavement. The taller one kept both feet planted, his stance squared and unmoving, like he had no intention of going anywhere. Margaret's steps didn't falter, though she was conscious of the echo of her shoes against the sidewalk. She could almost feel their eyes tracking her, a weight between her shoulder blades. In the reflection of the bank's glass door, she caught a clearer glimpse. Both of them were looking directly at her. Not in the casual, passing way strangers sometimes notice each other, but with a kind of deliberate focus that pulled the air tighter. One of them tilted his head slightly, saying something low to the other. Whatever it was, it made the taller one's mouth curve into a small, humorless smirk. The rest of the street felt emptied out, as though the small-town bustle had retreated all at once, leaving only her and them in the stretch of Pine Street. The surrounding buildings, with their shuttered shops and darkened windows, seemed to press in closer, muting the space between. A discarded coffee cup rolled slowly along the curb, caught in the weak breeze, its hollow rattle against the asphalt sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. She stepped into the vestibule of the bank, letting the glass door swing shut behind her, and began the motions of her withdrawal. The light overhead buzzed faintly, the screen of the ATM casting its pale glow across her hands. She went through the process by muscle memory, card in, pin entered, amount confirmed, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the image of their faces angled toward her, their postures too fixed to be casual. Through the glass, their figures remained framed under the street lamp's cone of yellow light. They hadn't moved on. The smaller one leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees now, as though ready to push off and stand straight in an instant. The taller one shifted his weight at last, but only to turn his body more in her direction. The glint of something metallic caught in the lamplight, maybe a watch, maybe just a zipper of his hoodie, but it made her pulse skip a beat all the same. She kept her movements deliberate, not hurried, rushing with signals she'd noticed, and she remembered enough from Daniel's quiet advice over the years to know that projecting calm was sometimes its own kind of shield. The cash slid into the dispenser slot, warm from the machine's inner workings. She folded it once, slipped it into her purse, and zipped the inner compartment shut. Her fingers brushed against the cool metal of her keys as she did, a small reassurance in their solid weight. For a moment, she stood still in the vestibule, looking down at the receipt as if double-checking her withdrawal. In truth, her gaze was angled just enough to catch their reflections in the glass door surface. They were no longer leaning. The smaller one had straightened, hands free now, hanging loose at his sides. The taller one adjusted the hood of his sweatshirt, then took a single step forward before stopping again. They weren't crossing the street yet, but she could feel the inevitability of it hanging there, stretched taut in the air between them. Margaret pushed the door open and stepped back into the chill. The lamplight pooled on the pavement just ahead, while the shadows under the trees between the bank and the next corner looked darker, than they had on the way here. She heard the faint scuff of a shoe against concrete from across the street, a sound too deliberate to be the wind. In her periphery, she saw the smaller one glance up and down the road. Scanning, she realized, and the taller one's head turned slightly in her direction again. Their focus hadn't broken once since she'd arrived. She didn't alter her pace as she began walking toward the intersection. The purse strap rested snug against her shoulder, the leather creaking softly with each step. She told herself she had walked this route hundreds of times without incident, but the thought did nothing to loosen the knot forming low in her stomach. The bus shelter receded slowly behind her, but the sensation of being watched did not fade. Somewhere in the quiet, the rhythm of Pine Street had shifted, and the night was no longer hers alone. Margaret often thought her life with Daniel as a long thread, unbroken and steady, weaving its way through decades of ordinary days and extraordinary moments. They had met in the summer of 1975, when she was working the counter at her aunt's small cafe on the edge of town. He had come in wearing a simple white t-shirt and faded jeans, the kind of clothes that didn't try to say much, but there was something about the way he carried himself. Upright, balanced, aware of the room. That caught her attention. He ordered coffee, black, and a slice of pie, and thanked her with a voice that was quiet but carried weight. She didn't know until later that he'd just returned from a second deployment, a young Marine home on leave, still adjusting to the stillness of civilian life. Their courtship had been uncomplicated but steady, much like him. He wasn't the sort to make grand gestures or fill the air with promises, but he kept every word he did speak. They would walk along the river in the evenings, his stride naturally longer than hers, and he would slow without making it obvious. She learned early that his silences weren't empty. They were full of thought, of watchfulness. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was with clarity that made her feel as though she'd been heard completely. They married in the fall of 1977 in the small town church she'd attended since childhood. The reception was modest, just friends, family, and a few of Daniel's fellow Marines who managed to make the trip. He wore his dress blues, the crisp lines and polished buttons a reflection of his precision in all things. She remembered how he stood that day, shoulders squared, chin up, but his eyes softened every time they met hers. The years that followed were marked by the rhythm of his service. Deployments came without much warning, and departures were handled with quiet efficiency. She never cried in front of him on the mornings he left. He once told her he needed to carry her strength with him as much as his own. Instead, she saved her tears for the walk home from the bus depot or the drive back from the base. She learned to write long letters, filling them with the details of home. The garden blooming, the dog getting older, the neighbors' latest stories. In return, his letters were precise, never dramatic, but full of the kind of reassurance that anchored her through the months apart. When he finally retired from the Corps after more than 2 decades, they settled fully into civilian life. Though traces of the Marine never left him, he still rose early, his movements quiet and deliberate, the bed made with sharp corners by the time she woke. He still scanned a room when they entered, noting exits, gauging the mood. Margaret came to realize those habits weren't paranoia. They were simply how he moved through the world. He believed in being ready for what might come, not in fear, but in discipline. They built their life in layers, raising 2 children, caring for her parents in their final years, weathering the slow shifts of time that changed their hair, their routines, and the pace of their days. The edges of youth softened into the deeper comfort of knowing each other's patterns without thought. She could read the set of his shoulders from across a room, could tell when he was listening for something or when he was thinking of a place far away. Even after retirement, Daniel kept a quiet readiness in the way he moved through life. If she called from the kitchen, he was there in moments, not because there was danger, but because he believed in being present. He never lost a habit of walking her to the car when she had errands in the evening or standing at the porch until she was safely inside after a late return. It was part care, part instinct, and wholly Daniel. In their 45 years of marriage, there had been arguments, of course, and hardships they had not anticipated. Financial strains, illnesses, the slow adjustments to grown children living their own lives. But none of it eroded the foundation they had built. If anything, those years of facing difficulties had deepened her trust in him. He had a way of standing his ground when others might falter, of deciding what was right and holding to it with a quiet certainty. That strength wasn't loud or boastful. It was in the way he'd spend hours fixing a neighbor's fence without being asked, or in the calm he brought to a crisis. Once, when her son had been in a car accident, it was Daniel who spoke steadily to the paramedics, who asked the questions Margaret couldn't find her voice for. She had leaned on that steadiness more times than she could count, though he never made her feel as though she were a burden. As she walked toward the ATM that night, the weight of her purse against her side, she carried more than grocery money. She carried the certainty that if Daniel were here, he would see everything she saw, perhaps even more. He would notice the two men across the street, without looking directly at them. He would read their stance, the tilt of their heads, the way they watched. And though he wasn't beside her in that moment, she felt the long thread of their years like an invisible tether, pulling him into her thoughts with the same quiet reassurance he had given her since the day they met. The town after dark had a way of stripping itself down to essentials. Pine Street, so often alive with the shuffle of footsteps and the low hum of conversation during the day, now stretched ahead like a stage emptied of its actors. The shop windows, once full of the bright disorder of daily commerce, were dark and still. Some displayed neat arrangements of merchandise frozen under dim interior lights, while others were nothing but black panes that reflected the occasional flash of a passing car far off on Main. Tonight, even that distant traffic was absent, leaving the street to its own quiet. A weak wind threaded between the buildings, carrying with it the faint, mingled sense of old brick, drying leaves, and something metallic from the bank's vestibule. Overhead, the lampposts hummed faintly, their light pooling in irregular patches on the pavement. Some burned steady, their cones of yellow casting sharp outlines of benches and trash bins, while others flickered in uneven rhythm, throwing quick, stuttering shadows across the sidewalk. That pulse of light and dark made the street seem almost alive, like it was breathing. The bank stood on the corner, its glass facade reflecting the nearest lamplight in fractured panels. The vestibule was lit with the unyielding brightness of fluorescence, the kind of light that flattened color and washed warmth from every surface. The outer glass door whispered shut behind Margaret, sealing her inside with the smell of clean plastic and faint ozone from the ATM. The machine waited against the far wall, its green backlight cutting through the brightness with a softer glow. The keypad gave us mechanical clicks under her fingers, the sound small but distinct in the stillness. Each step of the transaction seemed louder than it should have been, as though the quiet had grown so deep that it magnified every touch, every button press. The machine whirred softly as it processed, an almost polite sound, followed by the faint, deliberate shuffle of cash inside. There was a momentary pause, the hum deepening, before the thin metal gate slid open and the bills appeared in a neat stack. The smell of paper, faint and warm from the machine's inner mechanisms, rose as she reached for them. She folded the bills once and slid them into the inner zipper compartment of her purse, her fingers brushing the cool brass of the clasp before sealing it shut. The receipt printed with a muted hiss, curling slightly at the edge as it emerged. She took it and slipped it into her coat pocket without looking at the numbers. She knew them already. Through the glass walls, the town lay still. The street beyond seemed almost like a photograph, the flickering lamppost down the block marking time in its own irregular code. A dry leaf skittered along the curb, stopping briefly against the leg of a bench before the next stray gust carried it on. Somewhere far away, a dog barked twice, sharp and brief, and then fell silent again. Margaret lingered a second longer than necessary in the vestibule, letting her eyes adjust to the wider darkness outside. The reflective glare on the glass made the street harder to read, turning it into a double image, her own face and figure layered faintly over the empty stretch beyond. The effect was unsettling, like looking out at a world that might be looking back. She shifted slightly, angling her head so she could see past her own reflection to the bus shelter across the street, where two figures stood beneath the stuttering lamplight. The machine's hum faded now that it had finished its work, leaving only the buzz of the ceiling fixture and the faint hiss of the heating vent at floor level. She pushed open the glass door and stepped into the cool air, the change in temperature crisp against her face. The light behind her spilled out onto the sidewalk in a square of pale brightness, but ahead, the street folded back into shadow between the lamps. Each pool of light revealed the uneven texture of the sidewalk, cracks from long winters, patches of older cement darker than the rest. Between those islands of visibility, the darkness was softer but heavier, swallowing details. She moved forward, the purse close against her side, the sound of her footsteps blending with the faint rustle of leaves moving along the gutter. The town was quiet enough now that she could hear the lampposts themselves, a faint, steady vibration inside the poles, the kind of background noise that disappears a day but becomes a presence at night. One flickered again as she passed, and the shadow of her figure jumped across the wall of the bakery, growing long before shrinking back into its proper place. It wasn't just the absence of people that made Pine Street feel different after dark. It was the way familiar spaces seemed to step back from her, watching without warmth. The storefronts, the benches, even the street itself felt less like they belonged to town and more like they belonged to the night. And in that stripped-down version of the place she knew, every sound, every movement, every flicker of light seemed to matter. Margaret could hear it before she was entirely certain she believed it was happening. The change in the air that came when movement shifted from background noise to deliberate approach. It was a faint rhythm of footsteps hitting pavement in imperfect unison. Not the scattered pace of casual walkers, but the measured crossing of a short distance with a purpose. She didn't look directly at them at first. She kept her gaze forward, her pace steady, but her peripheral vision caught enough to tell her they were no longer leaning against a bus shelter. The two dark figures had left a pool of flickering lamplight behind and were now moving diagonally across the street, cutting the distance in a slow, unbroken line. One of them spoke, his voice low, pitched to stay between the two of them. She couldn't make out the words, only the sound, a muted murmur that carried a note of decision rather than casual conversation. The taller one walked half a step behind the other, scanning the sidewalks as they moved, his head turning slightly left and right in a practiced rhythm. The gesture wasn't restless. It was calculated, the way someone checks a space for eyes, for witnesses, for interruption. There was no traffic to interrupt them. Pine Street's quiet stretched in all directions, broken only by the uneven glow of the street lamps and the occasional rustle of wind to the bare branches. The storefront windows reflected their movement as they passed, long shadows sliding over the glossy glass and the drawn blinds behind it. The shorter one kept his hands in his hoodie pocket, shoulders slightly hunched, his focus never breaking from her. The taller one adjusted the set of his hood, glancing behind them once before looking across the road ahead. As though confirming the way was clear, Margaret kept her steps even, neither hurrying nor slowing, though she could feel her heartbeat finding a quicker rhythm. Her mind moved in parallel with her feet, running quiet calculations. The distance of the next intersection, the location of the nearest lit doorway, the absence of any open shop fronts between her and home. The purse strap pressed firmly into her shoulder as she shifted it closer to her side, without making it obvious. Their shoes made different sounds on the pavement, one a softer shuffle, the other a firm, quick step, and together they created a cadence that matched the tightening of the space around her. The taller one's glances continued, deliberate sweeps of the scene that now included brief looks over his shoulder, perhaps confirming that no one was coming up behind them. Each time his head turned back, it landed in her direction. She crossed under a lamppost, its light pooling pale against the sidewalk, and felt the open stretch of shadow ahead of her like a corridor she would have to walk. The men reached the curb on her side of the street as she entered that darker stretch, the shorter one stepping down, without breaking stride, the taller one lingering for half a second before following. It wasn't hesitation, it was timing. Their conversation had gone silent now, the low murmur replaced by the sound of their footsteps echoing faintly against the closed shop fronts. Margaret resisted the urge to look over her shoulder. Instead, she caught sight of them in the angled reflection of a window she passed, their figures closing the gap. The shorter ones had bent slightly forward, the taller one's eyes not on the ground but on the space between them and her. The town's quiet seemed to deepen around them, as if the small sounds of night had stepped aside. She heard the faint click of a loose manhole cover shifting under weight somewhere behind, a muted metallic ring that came and went quickly. The taller man's head made another sweep, this time slower, his gaze holding on a stretch of empty street before returning forward. The shorter one's stride lengthened slightly, not enough to seem like a chase, but enough to take back a little more of the distance between them. Margaret's breathing stayed controlled. the kind of measured inhale and exhale she had learned over years of steadying herself during moments she couldn't control. Her eyes scanned the approaching cross street, the faint light of a distant porch barely visible beyond the corner. She knew that Daniel, if he were here, would have noticed the way their steps matched hers in intent, if not in speed, the way one kept scanning while the other kept focus. And though he wasn't beside her, she felt that instinct, the one she had learned from years at his side, rise to the surface. She kept walking, aware that the space behind her was shrinking, the sound of their shoes carrying a message she didn't need words to understand. The touch came lightly at first, almost as if by accident, but there was nothing accidental about the placement. Fingers landed just above the curve of her shoulder, the pressure firm enough to halt her forward motion without seeming abrupt. Margaret stopped mid-step, the sudden stillness of her body matching the tightening in her chest. The street around them remained silent, the kind of quiet that seemed to deepen when movement ceased, every sound now amplified in the absence of her footfalls. She didn't turn immediately. The way of the hand told her enough, that someone had closed the last of the distance between them and now stood inside the small circle of air she considered hers. The hand was warm even to the fabric of her coat, the grip neither rough nor gentle, but deliberate. "You dropped something," the voice said, pitched in an almost casual register, as if this were a friendly interruption. But the tone carried a flatness that didn't match the words, and his body stayed directly in her path, forcing her to stop where the sidewalk narrowed between the brick wall of the old bakery and the edge of the curb. She turned her head slowly, enough to bring him into view without giving the motion the appearance of alarm. The hood of his sweatshirt shadowed most of his face, but she could make out the shape of his mouth, the tight line that wasn't quite a smile. His other hand remained buried in the front pocket of his hoodie, the fabric stretching slightly with the outline of whatever he was holding, or simply making her think he might be holding something. Behind him, just a step or two farther back, the taller one lingered at an angle, his posture angled outward toward the street, his eyes flicking briefly up and down the block. That scanning motion repeated, slow and methodical, as though he were taking stock of every doorway, every window, every possible interruption. No one else was visible. The lamppost light above them sputtered once, dimming just enough to shift their shadows across the wall before flaring again. Margaret's purse hung between her body and the brick, her arm pressed lightly against it in a way that kept it close without looking defensive. She knew that her next movements mattered. Too quick, and they would read her fear. Too slow, and they would interpret hesitation as weakness. "What is it you think I dropped?" she asked, her voice calm enough to pass for polite curiosity. The shorter one gave a small shrug, his fingers tightening just slightly on her shoulder before releasing. "Thought I saw something fall back there. Maybe I was wrong." His gaze flicked downward toward the purse, and then back up, the glance quick but not subtle. The taller one shifted his weight, a barely audible scrape of his shoe on the pavement. The angle of his body closed a little, narrowing the gap on her other side. The street beyond them remained empty, the storefronts behind their glass like dark mirrors. Somewhere far off, a car door slammed, muffled by distance, and the sound faded without bringing footsteps or voices closer. Margaret felt the seconds stretching, each one thick with the possibility of movement in any direction. Her breath stayed steady, though she was aware of the way her pulse had moved up into her throat. The shorter one stepped half a pace backward, just enough to give the impression of making room. But his presence didn't lift from the space between them. "You out here by yourself?" he asked, and though the words could have been conversational, the weight behind them was anything but. She held his gaze without answer, letting the question hang. Years with Daniel had taught her the power of silence, of not rushing to fill a space someone else had opened. The absence of her reply seemed to shift the air slightly, an interruption to the script he might have been expecting. The taller one made another slow scan of the street, his eyes pausing on the intersection behind them before coming back to her. The lamppost above gave another flicker, its brief dimness sharpening the sense that this moment was contained, sealed off from the rest of the world. Margaret didn't step back. She adjusted the strap of her purse with a small movement, a gesture that brought her arm up between her body and his, re-establishing a fraction of distance. Her feet remained planted, the line of her shoulders unbroken. The shorter one's mouth twitched, A quick movement that might have been irritation or something closer to calculation. The taller one finally spoke, his voice lower, pitched for his companion. "We should keep moving." It wasn't agreement. Exactly. More practical observation. The shorter one hesitated, eyes holding on her for another beat before he stepped aside, the path forward opening by a narrow margin. Margaret moved through the space they left, her pace unhurried, the sound of her shoes against the sidewalk measured and even. She didn't look back, but she knew they were still there, the rhythm of their steps shifting behind her. The air carried that awareness in every breath she took, the encounter still pressing against her skin like the memory of the hand on her shoulder. Margaret took a few steps forward, putting a little more space between herself and the two men, and let her eyes sweep the street ahead. The familiar landmarks of Pine Street stood where they always had, but tonight they offered no comfort. Across the road, the coffee shop with its bright green awning was dark, the chalkboard sign that usually leaned against the door tucked away somewhere inside. Normally at this hour, its windows glowed with warm light, the hum of conversation spilling faintly onto the sidewalk. It was the kind of place that stayed open later than most, serving the late workers from the post office or the handful of college students who brought laptops and settled into the corner booths. She had counted on its presence more than once, its steady light, the low murmur of people inside, as an anchor when she walked home after sundown. Tonight, the absence of that light was stark, the glass reflecting nothing but the weak glow from the nearest street lamp. She slowed briefly, as if to confirm what her eyes were already telling her. A hand-lettered notice was taped to the inside of the glass door, but from this distance she couldn't make out the words. The emptiness inside was absolute. Chairs tucked in, counters bare, no clatter of cups or hiss of the espresso machine. Even the hanging pendant lamps over the counter were dark, their shapes barely visible in the shadows. Her gaze shifted further down the block to the small gas station on the corner, its faded sign just visible between the bare branches of a tree. Usually the fluorescent lights over the pumps glared against the night, casting everything around them in a harsh white glow. It was a place she disliked for its darkness, but it had always been a kind of reassurance. Light meant people, and people meant interruption if something went wrong. Tonight, those pumps sat in darkness, the station's glass front reflecting only the occasional flicker from a lamppost. The interior was dark, shelves just faint outlines against the dim shapes of refrigerators in the back. A chain had been looped through the handles of the entrance doors, a faint metallic glint under the streetlight. The realization settled in slowly, like cold water creeping through fabric. Every point on this street that usually offered some form of refuge or witness had been quietly erased for the night. No barista wiping down counters and glancing toward the sidewalk. No gas station clerk looking up from a register to watch who passed. Just her, the stillness, and the muted scuff of footsteps somewhere behind her. She adjusted her pace without thinking, neither speeding up nor slowing down, but keeping a rhythm that felt deliberate. The sound of her own movement filled the empty space around her, a soft, steady tap that seemed unnaturally loud. Between her and the nearest cross street, the only light came in small pools under the lampposts, separated by stretches of shadow. Margaret knew the neighborhood well enough to picture what lay in those shadows. The closed boutique with its painted door, the shuttered laundromat with its humming machine silenced, the dentist's office with blinds drawn tight over the waiting room chairs. But tonight, each of those places felt farther away than their physical distance. The absence of light made them seem like hollow shells, their interiors locked away from whatever might happen outside. The coffee shop's emptiness stayed with her as she walked, its sudden closure an unexpected gap in the map of her evening. She thought of the young woman who usually worked the counter at this hour, quick with a greeting for regulars, always sliding a small plate of biscotti across the counter for children who came in with their parents. That woman would have been visible from here, framed in the window, another set of eyes in the night. But the glass now was a mirror, and all it gave back was Margaret's own moving shape, and behind her, faint and blurred, the suggestion of figures keeping pace. She crossed under another lamppost, the cold metal base ringing faintly as the wind pushed a loose sign against it. Beyond the light's edge, the street fell into shadow again, the next pool of illumination farther away than she liked. The darkened gas station loomed ahead, its emptiness pressing against the edges of her awareness. Without the glare of its lights, the corner felt muted, as though the night had claimed it entirely. The combination of both closures, the coffee shop and the gas station, created a stretch of street that was not just quiet, but void of interruption. No cars pulled in for fuel, no customers stepping out with paper cups in hand. Just silence, long and uninterrupted, stretching between her and whatever might be waiting in the next block. She became acutely aware of the space between each of her steps, the way the sound landed on the pavement and was swallowed up almost immediately. Every so often, she caught the faint echo of other footsteps, paced differently, behind her, without light, without the casual oversight of open businesses. Pine Street had turned into a place where every movement felt sharper, every shadow heavier. And in that moment, she understood that she was crossing a section of town where the night belonged to whoever decided to claim it. Daniel adjusted the brim of his old Marine Corps cap as he stepped off the curb, the sound of his boots solid against the cracked pavement. The night air carried a faint bite, the kind of crispness that hinted at frost by morning, and he drew it in slowly, letting it clear the lingering haze of beer and conversation from the VFW hall. He'd spent the last 2 hours at the familiar corner table, talking with men who understood the rhythm of his pauses, who filled in the silences with their own war stories and left the things better unsaid to rest. Now, the street felt like another world, quiet, emptied of its daytime chatter, its edges softened by shadow. His route home was the same one he'd taken for years, a habit worn into him as firmly as the creases in his jacket. Pine Street was always part of it, a narrow strip of small-town life that seemed unchanging no matter how many seasons passed. He knew its storefronts the way some men knew the faces of their old platoon. The bakery with its painted sign of a steaming loaf, the florist shop with a display window that changed each week, the modest bank with a green awning over its ATM. Most evenings he passed through without thinking, letting the familiar shapes lead him home on autopilot. Tonight, though, something about the street felt different before he could put a finger on why. The coffee shop was dark, odd, given its usual habit of staying open until the last student with a laptop finally packed up. Its windows reflected nothing but the lamplight and the occasional movement of leaves in the wind. Across the way, the gas station was just as still, its pumps dark, the glass door locked and chained. That left the street bare of its usual pockets of life, the emptiness pressing in from both sides. He kept walking, his hands deep in the pockets of his jacket, eyes scanning out of old reflex more than suspicion. A Marine never fully turned that part of himself off. Even decades later, every angle of light and shadow registered in his mind, every sound, however faint, slotted into place. It was then he heard it. The muffled scuff of shoes that weren't his own, their rhythm out of sync with his stride. His gaze swept the sidewalk ahead, then shifted to the far side of the street. Near the bus shelter, two figures stood in a loose posture that tried too hard to look casual. Hoodies up, hands tucked away, heads turning in unison towards something or someone down the block. Daniel slowed his pace fractionally, not enough to draw attention, but enough to let the picture ahead settle into focus. The line of his sight followed theirs, and he caught the movement near the ATM. It took him less than a second to recognize a small, familiar frame in a long coat, the way the fabric shifted as she leaned toward the machine. Margaret. She was alone, her purse resting against her side, her shoulders slightly hunched away they always were when she was counting her cash before slipping it away. He felt a muscle tighten just under his ribs, a sensation that had nothing to do with the cold. The two men across the street shifted, pushing off in the shelter, as if drawn by some signal only they shared. One of them glanced up and down the road, the other keeping his gaze fixed ahead. Daniel's eyes followed their movement, noting the distance between them and Margaret, the narrowing gap as they stepped off the curb. The street remained still otherwise. No headlights coming around the corner, no doors opening to spill light onto the sidewalk. He adjusted his pace again, the old rhythm from patrols in unfamiliar territory sliding back into his steps. Each move felt measured, deliberate. His boots struck the ground with quiet certainty, carrying him closer to the point where Pine Street shadows gathered. The cap on his head, the jacket zipped just enough to cut the wind, the weight of his frame, all that was ordinary to anyone who didn't know him. But under it ran something sharper, a wire pulled tight. In the quiet, his mind moved with the same precision it had in his 20s, the years and uniform sharpening instincts that had never dulled. He measured the distance, how many steps between himself and her, between her and them. He noted the angle of the nearest lamppost, the width of the shadows, the possible exit points if things moved quickly. And beneath it all, a calm settled in. This was no different from 100 moments when the space between threat and safety came down to timing. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint hum of the ATM spitting out bills and the softer, almost imperceptible murmur of voices not meant to be overheard. Daniel's eyes stayed forward, but his mind tracked every motion ahead. Pine Street stretched out like a narrowed corridor, and in the stillness, he knew he had just stepped into a moment that would not be walked through on autopilot. Daniel's boots kept an even rhythm against the pavement, the sound absorbed by the quiet of Pine Street. He was thinking about nothing urgent, letting his mind drift in the way it sometimes did on these evening walks. There was comfort in the routine, passing the closed florist shop, noting the week's new display in the darkened window, glancing at the bakery's chalkboard still advertising the day specials. The kind of small-town details that had marked the edges of his life for decades. He had no reason to rush. No reason to think the night would be any different from the hundreds of others he'd walk home through. Half a block ahead, the glow of the bank's ATM shone faintly against the sidewalk, but he didn't focus on it. His attention was on the sound of the wind threading through the bare branches above, the smell of wood smoke from some distant chimney. He thought about the conversations at the VFW, the way Bill was still telling the same story about Okinawa, how Mark's limp had been acting up with the weather change. These were the things filling his head, not the possibility that his own wife could be standing in that pale circle of light, with two strangers closing in. For Margaret, the world at that moment was nothing like the one Daniel inhabited. She stood just a few feet from the ATM, her back partially turned, feeling the air shift as one of the men stepped closer. The scent of cigarette smoke clung to his hoodie, mixing with the metallic tang of the ATM's keypad under her fingers. Every nerve in her body told her she was no longer alone, that the empty street had changed. Her pulse quickened in her ears, drowning out the hum of the machine. The man's voice came low, almost conversational, but the weight of his presence blocked out the rest of the world. Behind him, the second man lingered just far enough away to look like he wasn't involved, but close enough to close the distance in seconds. Margaret's eyes flicked toward the darkened coffee shop across the street, searching for movement, for any sign that someone might still be inside. Nothing. The gas station beyond it was a black silhouette against the sky. She adjusted her purse strap on her shoulder, without thinking, a small movement to remind herself she still had control over something. Daniel's pace remained steady. The ATM was only a part of the background to him, another fixture he'd pass 1,000 times without thought. The hooded figures weren't yet close enough for him to read their posture as anything more than idle loitering. He was still half a block away, caught in his own easy rhythm, the brim of his cap shading his eyes from the lamplight. He could have been walking anywhere, through any quiet town on any unremarkable night. Margaret, meanwhile, felt the street pressing in. The man closest to her shifted slightly, not enough to touch her, but enough to claim the space between them as his. His tone remained casual, but the undercurrent was unmistakable, a soft, unspoken insistence that she wasn't going anywhere until he decided she could. She could feel the other one watching, his gaze flicking between her and the street as if measuring how much time they had. Her hand hovered over the cash the ATM had just released, her body caught between the urge to grab it and go, and the knowledge that sudden movements might make things worse. Daniel's eyes scanned the storefronts ahead as he walked, noticing without registering the slight movement by the bank. It was only when a shadow shifted against the lit wall of the ATM enclosure that something in him began to pay attention. Not suspicion yet, but awareness, a quiet notch higher on the scale his instinct still used. He slowed his breathing without realizing it, letting his steps carry him forward while the rest of his senses began to tune to the space ahead. For Margaret, the minutes stretched. She kept her voice steady as she told the man she was just finishing up, hoping the sound of her own calm might steady her nerves. Inside, she was measuring distances just as Daniel would have if he'd been there beside her. The steps to the curb, the reach to the ATM slot, the space between her and the man's arm blocking her view of the street. The world around her felt sharpened at the edges, each small sound amplified. The flap of a loose sign in the wind, the whirring click of the ATM's internal printer, the faint crunch of gravel under shoe somewhere behind her. Two different worlds moved on the same stretch of pavement. Daniel still wrapped in the steady comfort habit. Margaret's contracted into the sharp focus of a cornered moment. In seconds, those worlds would collide, but for now, they moved parallel, unaware how quickly the distance between them was closing. Margaret kept her hands loose at her sides, resisting the instinct to clutch her purse tighter. The air between her and the man felt heavy, charged, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. Decades ago, in their first years of marriage, Daniel had spoken to her about moments like this. Not these exact circumstances, but the kind where fear could make you act too soon, too fast. He had told her once, during a long drive back from visiting his family, that control in dangerous situations often came from doing less, not more. "Stay steady," he had said, glancing at her in the passenger seat. "Let them make the first mistake. It'll tell you what kind of fight you're in." At the time, she hadn't thought much about it. Daniel had a way of tucking small pieces of advice into ordinary conversations, as if he were putting coins into a jar she didn't know she'd need to open one day. Over the years, she realized those words came from a place she could never fully know. His time overseas, the split-second choices that could decide whether someone lived or didn't. He rarely spoke about those years directly, but when he did, she listened, storing the lessons somewhere deep. Now, standing in the pale glow of the ATM screen, she reached for that memory like a handhold. She didn't move back. She didn't speak first. She let the silence settle, forcing the man in front of her to fill it. His weight shifted from one foot to the other, his eyes scanning her face, looking for something, fear maybe or hesitation. She gave him neither. Her voice, when it came, was calm, almost bored. She asked him if he needed the machine next, as if this were a polite line and nothing more. It was a deliberate play. Margaret knew that showing panic would lock her into a script, not hers. If she could keep her tone even, keep her body still, she could at least slow down whatever he thought he was going to do. Beside him, the second man gave a short laugh, not loud enough to carry down the street. He kept glancing behind him, checking the emptiness of the block. That told her something, too. If they were confident, they wouldn't be looking for interruptions. The man in front of her leaned in slightly, just enough for her to smell the sharp scent of nicotine on his breath. He asked if she'd just withdrawn her money. It was phrased like a question, but it wasn't one. She let her gaze flicker to his face, meeting his eyes without challenge, then glanced away, as though the topic didn't warrant her full attention. Inside, she was mapping the sound of the street, marking the distance to the nearest open space, listening for footsteps other than theirs. She remembered Daniel once describing how people reveal themselves when they're forced to act. "The first move they make tells you who they are," he'd said. "An impatient one? He's sloppy. A careful one? You've got to be smarter than him. But they always move first if you let them." She could almost hear his voice now, steady and low, a counterweight to the tension coiling in her stomach. So she waited. The ATM spat out her receipt, the sound sharp in the stillness. And she didn't reach for the cash immediately. That small delay made him blink, a tiny falter in his control. It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack she could watch. His hand shifted toward her, fingers hovering just shy of her arm, testing her reaction. She gave him none. The quiet stretched. Margaret's breathing stayed slow, her eyes relaxed but alert. The man seemed to weigh his next move, his glance flicking once more to his companion, who gave the faintest nod. That was the signal she'd been waiting for. Not to act recklessly, but to know the moment was shifting, that the balance between them had changed. What she couldn't see yet was Daniel, just steps away now, his own instincts sharpening as the scene in front of him came into focus. What she could control was herself, holding to the lesson that had lived in her for decades. Stay steady, and sooner or later, they'd give you the opening you needed. The demand came without preamble, a low, flat statement from the man in front of her. "Give me the purse." There was no rise in his voice, no dramatic bark authority, just a controlled firmness that told her he expected compliance. Behind her, she caught the faint crunch of shoe on loose gravel as the second man moved into position, cutting off the only clear path toward the sidewalk. She didn't need to turn to know what he was doing. She could feel the air shift with his presence, the narrowing of space around her. Margaret kept her eyes on the one speaking. His hoodie shadowed most of his features, but she could see the set of his jaw, the slight flare of his nostrils, the way his fingers flexed once at his side. He wasn't nervous, not yet, but there was a current running under his words, a note of urgency he couldn't quite hide. That urgency was something she could work with. People who wanted things quickly made mistakes. Her purse hung from her shoulder, the worn strap creasing at the point where it met her collarbone. The leather was cracked in places, softened by years of use. Inside were her bank card, her folded grocery list, a coin pouch, and the small stack of bills she'd withdrawn. Nothing in it was worth her safety, but she wasn't prepared to hand it over without reading the full shape of the situation first. She shifted her weight slightly, not as a defensive stance, but as if adjusting to the cool air, her expression unchanged. The man behind her cleared his throat, a small, impatient sound, and stepped closer until she could sense the warmth radiating from his body. She didn't flinch, didn't lean away. Daniel had told her once, during a walk years ago, that giving ground too early only confirmed to someone that you were theirs to move. If you could stand in place without shrinking, it disrupted their rhythm. The one in front took her silence as hesitation. "Lady, I'm not going to ask again," he said, his voice tightening now, the calm veneer beginning to strain. He glanced over her shoulder, a flicker of communication with his partner, and she noticed his hands. Not trembling, not clenched, just open, ready. He hadn't decided yet whether this was going to turn physical. That told her she still had a sliver of control. Margaret allowed her gaze to drop briefly to her purse, then back to his face, as though weighing a request. She spoke slowly, the way someone might when they were trying to be sure they understood. "And if I don't?" It wasn't a challenge, not in her tone, but the question froze him for a beat. Behind her, the other man muttered something under his breath, too low for her to catch entirely, but the word time was clear. They were worried about it running out. That was important. It meant they weren't operating with full confidence in their surroundings. Maybe they'd noticed the sound of distant footsteps. Maybe they were aware the street, though empty now, could change in a moment. She didn't know what was making them uneasy, but she could feel it pressing at them. The man in front stepped in closer, enough that she could smell the faint trace of aftershave under the sharper edge of cigarette smoke. His hand lifted slightly, not quite touching the purse strap, but hovering just above it. "Don't make this harder," he said, the words more clipped now. It was meant to sound like authority, but to her it sounded like the edge of impatience. Margaret breathed in once, letting the cold air settle her nerves. She didn't know how much longer she could play for time, but she knew she wasn't alone on this street anymore. Somewhere behind a narrowing circle of her focus, a familiar stride was closing the distance, measured, deliberate, carrying with it the weight of someone who had learned long ago how to walk toward trouble without hesitation. The men didn't see him yet. Their attention was fixed on her, on the small, battered purse that suddenly seemed to mean more to them than it possibly could. And so she stayed still, her voice steady, buying seconds she didn't intend to waste, knowing each one brought Daniel closer. Daniel's boots met the sidewalk with the same measured rhythm. They always did on his evening walk. But the moment he turned onto Pine Street, the pattern broke. Ahead, framed beneath the pale cone of light from a flickering street lamp, was Margaret's silhouette. He knew it instantly. The slight curve of her shoulders, the way she held her head high even when standing still. But there was something different in the way she stood now, something that didn't fit with the quiet calm she carried to the decades he'd known her. Her weight was too centered, her arms too still, her chin angled just enough to tell him she wasn't relaxed. His eyes narrowed slightly, the old habit of scanning a scene kicking in before his mind even formed a thought. He caught movement. Two figures close to her, one standing directly in her path, the other positioned just behind. Their stance wasn't casual. They were angled toward her, closing off space, controlling her options. Daniel's pace didn't change. To anyone watching, he might have looked like just another passerby taking his time. But inside, the old instincts had already sharpened. From years in the Marines, he'd learned to read posture as fluently as language. The man in front of Margaret leaned slightly forward, his shoulders squared in a way that telegraphed dominance. The one behind her shifted weight from foot to foot, scanning the street with short, darting glances. That was the lookout. They weren't simply loitering. They were working in tandem. Daniel's gaze dropped briefly to Margaret's purse strap lying across her shoulder. It was still there, her hand resting near it, but not gripping. That told him she hadn't yet surrendered it, and more importantly, that she was holding her ground. He read the set of her jaw from where he stood. Calm, deliberate. She wasn't panicking. That gave him the space to approach without escalating too fast. He shifted slightly to the left side of the street as he closed the distance, keeping his line of sight clear. His breathing slowed, not from fatigue but from control, the same way he'd steady himself before entering a room where the next move could matter more than the last. He let the sounds of the street fill in the space between them. The faint hum of the ATM, the whisper of wind catching a loose flyer on the bus shelter, the soft scuff of one of the men's shoes against concrete. Every detail was information, and every piece of it shaped the way he would step in. Margaret hadn't turned to see him yet, but he didn't need her to. He could tell from the angle of her head that she was aware of her surroundings, holding the kind of stillness that came from calculation, not fear. That was something he'd taught her long ago, without ever imagining she'd have to use it. Stay steady. Let them make the first mistake. It wasn't a line from a manual. It was a way to keep control when control seemed gone. The man behind her shifted again, and Daniel caught the faint change in Margaret's posture, her shoulders tensing just enough to signal she knew he was close. That tiny adjustment told him all he needed. She was alert, she was stalling, and she was waiting for an opening. He kept walking, every step deliberate. His hands hung loosely at his sides, but his gaze never left the small triangle of space they occupied. He was close enough now to read their expressions. The one in front had his mouth set in a hard line, but there was uncertainty in his eyes, like a player in a game suddenly realizing the clock was running faster than expected. The one behind her noticed Daniel then, his glance cutting toward him, quick and assessing. Daniel didn't look away. There was no need to rush. The moment would come on its own, and when it did, he would already be exactly where he needed to be. Daniel's body shifted almost imperceptibly, but the change in him was absolute. The easy, unhurried gait he had carried down Pine Street dissolved in an instant. His stride shortened, landing with more weight and purpose, each step hitting the pavement like the measured beat of a drum. His head lowered slightly, his eyes locking forward, no longer scanning the storefronts or the glow of windows. The warmth that had softened his presence just moments before was gone, replaced by something sharper, something older. Years of training had conditioned his body to make the change without hesitation. One moment the relaxed man on an evening walk, the next a force moving toward an objective. His shoulders rolled forward, not in aggression but in preparation, his hands loosening at his sides in a way that left him ready for anything. He closed the space between them faster now, not running, not announcing himself, but moving with a direct line of someone who had decided where he was going and would not be stopped. The cool night air felt different as his pace quickened, no longer a gentle autumn breeze, but current pushing against him. The sound of his boots on the sidewalk deepened, the rhythm steady, deliberate. From the corner of his eye, he registered the way to look out, the one behind Margaret, tense as soon as Daniel's approach became unmistakable. A faint ripple of unease passed through the young man's posture, enough to confirm what Daniel already knew. They were not expecting interference, and certainly not from someone like him. Margaret hadn't moved. Her stillness was a fixed point in the frame, but he knew she could sense the change. It was in the way her chin lifted just a fraction, her body angling as if she could feel the shift in the air. She didn't need to turn to recognize the sound of his stride. 45 years of marriage had made that rhythm as familiar to her as her own breath. Daniel's had stayed low, his gaze tracking the space between the two men and his wife. The lamplight caught the brim of his cap, casting a shadow over his face, obscuring everything but the intensity in his eyes. He wasn't thinking about what he might say when he reached them. Not yet. Words were tools, and tools only mattered if the groundwork was laid. Right now, he was building the pressure that would make those tools effective. The man in front of Margaret noticed him a heartbeat later. Daniel saw it in the flicker of his eyes, the slight hesitation that loosened his stance. That was all it took to tilt the balance. The predator's confidence wavered, and Daniel kept moving, silent but unmistakable, filling the street with a presence that didn't need to be announced. Every step brought more detail into focus. The faded lettering on the bus shelter, the glint of metal from the ATM slot, the rough stitching on the lookout's hoodie. His mind filed them away automatically, not because they mattered in this moment, but because the habit of observation never left him. He had been in too many situations where the smallest detail turned out to be the lever that shifted everything. By the time he closed to within a dozen feet, his pace had slowed just enough to reassert control, but not enough to ease attention. He knew how to walk the fine line between approach and confrontation, between presence and escalation. He let the silence stretch, each second tightening the invisible core between them. The warmth from earlier in the evening was gone completely now, replaced by a quiet authority that seemed to fill the cold night air. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every movement, every deliberate step forward, was already speaking for him. And the message was simple. The situation had changed, and it was no longer theirs to control. It was as if the entire street took a breath and held it. The faint rustle of leaves that had been whispering along the gutter just moments before fell away, the branches overhead no longer swaying. Even the flickering lamppost across from the bank seemed to steady, its erratic pulse settling into a weak but constant glow. The usual hum of the town, distant traffic, a door closing somewhere, the muffled clink of dishes from an apartment above the shops, was gone. In its place was a stillness that wrapped around everything, thick and complete, as though the air itself had decided not to move until this moment resolved. Daniel's boots made the only sound, the slow, measured cadence of each step against the cracked pavement. It wasn't loud, but in the silence it carried, drawing every ear in its reach toward him. The two young men shifted in their places, their eyes darting between each other, and the figure moving steadily toward them. The one closest to Margaret had started with the upper hand. His voice casual, his stance just a little too close, but that thin layer of control was slipping. His shoulders tightened, his breath caught for a fraction too long, and his tone dropped low enough that his words to the other man were lost in the quiet. Margaret noticed it too. The air between her and the one blocking her path had changed. She could feel it even before Daniel reached them. There was a faint pressure in the space now, the kind that pressed on the skin without touching it. She didn't look back, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her seek reassurance. But she knew he was there. She knew that walk. Daniel kept his gaze fixed, not on their faces yet, but on the ground just past them, as if his destination lay beyond, and they were only an obstruction in the way. It was an old technique, one he'd used in more than a few tense situations. Don't look at the threat until you're ready to deal with it. Let them feel the approach without knowing the exact second you'll lock eyes. That moment of uncertainty was often more effective than any word you could speak. The wind tried once or twice to stir again, lifting a strand of Margaret's hair before retreating. It was as though even nature had decided to step aside, to let the moment play out without interference. Somewhere far off, a car door shut, but the sound was faint, distant, irrelevant. Here, in this patch of Pine Street, the world had narrowed to four people, a patch of uneven sidewalk, and the quiet tension that bound them together. The younger of the two men shifted his weight, one foot scraping against concrete, as if testing the option of retreat. His friend didn't move, but Daniel saw the subtle way his jaw tightened, the way his breath had gone shallow. He recognized it immediately. Not fear yet, but the first steps toward it. And fear, once it started, had a way of picking up speed all on its own. Daniel's pace didn't change. Every step was calculated, deliberate, as though the distance between them was something to be measured and closed with precision. He had no need to rush. Rushing would have meant giving him the advantage of his intention. Instead, he let the silence work for him, let it stretch long enough that each second felt heavier than the last. By the time he was close enough for the lamplight to cut across his face, the stillness was absolute. No car passed. No voice called out from a doorway. The night held itself in check, every sound, every movement waiting. Daniel let the moment settle before letting his eyes finally rise to meet theirs. And in that instant, with no more than a look, the dynamic shifted completely. The words landed in the air like a stone dropped into still water, sending out invisible ripples that touched everyone in the scene. They weren't loud, not the kind of volume that draws attention from blocks away, but they carried a weight that made them impossible to ignore. Calm, steady, and low, Daniel's tone was the kind that demanded an answer before anyone even thought about giving one. It was a voice shaped by years of command, of being in situations where hesitation could cost lives. Margaret didn't have a turn to know it was him. She had heard that exact tone in moments both ordinary and dire, when he'd broken up a drunken argument outside the VFW, when a stranger had gotten too close in a dim parking lot years ago, when bad news had come and he'd steadied her before she could even react. It was the same voice he'd once used to bring Marines twice his size to attention without raising above a conversational level. To anyone else, it might have sounded like a simple question. To her, it was the sound of a storm arriving in precise formation. The two young men reacted in different ways. The one standing behind her stiffened, his eyes darting past her shoulder toward the source. The other, the one who had been speaking to her, tried to maintain the casual slouch in his posture, but his body betrayed him. His hand, which had been loosely gesturing toward her purse, dropped to his side, and his weight shifted back just enough to signal uncertainty. Daniel took another step forward, closing more of the gap. The lamplight caught the sharp angles of his face, the deep lines carved by decades of life, and the unmistakable set of his jaw. His hands hung loosely at his sides, but there was nothing relaxed about his presence. He didn't need to raise his fists or show aggression. The control in his stance was enough to make the space feel smaller, tighter. Margaret's breath eased just slightly, not because she thought the danger had passed. It hadn't. But because she knew the balance had shifted. She could sense it in the way the one behind her moved half a step back, unsure if he still wanted to block her escape. She could feel in the silence that followed Daniel's words, the kind that demanded an answer yet left no good options for the ones who had to give it. The young man in front of her tried first. "Nah, man, we're just talking." His voice wavered at the edges, an unconvincing attempt at nonchalance. Daniel didn't respond right away. He let the words sit in the open, unacknowledged, the pause stretching just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Then he took another step closer, the sound of his boots on pavement sharp in the quiet. "Because from where I'm standing," he said, his tone still level but carrying an edge now, "it looks like something else." He didn't look at Margaret yet, keeping his attention locked on the one who'd spoken. It was a tactic. Make the other man hold his gaze, make him account for his actions without letting him glance away. The second one, the one behind her, cleared his throat as if to speak, then thought better of it. His shoes scuffed against the sidewalk, a restless movement that signaled he was already thinking about leaving. Margaret stayed still, her purse still in her grip, the weight of the cash inside almost forgotten now. The moment had shifted from her to Daniel entirely, and she knew better than to interrupt the rhythm he had set. The night seemed to lean in around them, the silence hanging thick in the space between each word, each step. Daniel waited, his expression unreadable, his body language saying more than any threat could. It was a kind of presence that didn't need to prove itself, the kind that came from a lifetime of knowing when to speak, when to act, and when to simply stand in a way that made others think twice. And right now, that presence was all the answer the two men needed. They didn't know him, but they knew enough. It was in the way their eyes darted. Not nervously at first, but calculating, trying to measure what they were dealing with. Daniel stood a few paces away, his weight balanced evenly, his shoulders squared, his spine straight as a post. There was nothing showy about his stance, no puffed chest or exaggerated flex to make himself look bigger. He simply stood the way he always had, as though every muscle in his body knew its place and purpose. And that was enough to make them pause. The taller of the two let his gaze drop to Daniel's hands, loose at his sides but not idle. They weren't clenched, they weren't fidgeting, just ready. That stillness was unsettling, because it didn't match the bluster they were used to seeing from men who tried to act tough. This was different. This was quiet readiness, the kind that came from someone who didn't need to prove himself. The shorter one, the one who had been blocking Margaret's way out, shifted his feet as though trying to plant himself more firmly, but the movement lacked confidence. He glanced at his friend, as if to check for agreement on what to do next, and in that split second of silence, Daniel's eyes met his. The effect was immediate. Whatever words had been forming in his mind seemed to dissolve before they could be spoken. It wasn't just the look, it was the history behind it. Daniel's eyes carried a steadiness that didn't come from standing in front of an ATM at night. It came from years of reading people in high-stakes situations, of knowing when they were bluffing, when they were about to break, and when they were about to do something they regret. That knowledge didn't need to be spoken. It was there in the way he watched them, unflinching. The taller man's lips pressed together, in a thin line. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but his gaze flicked over Daniel's frame again. The squared shoulders, the solid stance, the way his feet were set apart at just the right distance for balance. There was no bravado in it, no wasted movement, nothing that hinted at hesitation. It was the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime prepared to act the moment it became necessary. The space between the four of them seemed to tighten, the air dense with unspoken recognition. Margaret didn't move, but she could feel the way the two men's attention had shifted from her to Daniel completely now. They weren't looking at her purse, at her hands, at her face. They were looking at him, weighing the risk of whatever they had planned against the man standing in their way. One of them gave a short, shallow laugh, an attempt to defuse attention, but the sound fell flat. Daniel didn't react to it. He simply held his ground, eyes steady, breathing slow and even. That unshakable calm was the kind of thing that could unnerve anyone who didn't understand it. The taller one finally muttered something under his breath, too quiet for Margaret to catch, and jerked his chin toward the street as if suggesting they go. The shorter one hesitated, his pride caught between not wanting to back down and not wanting to test what he already suspected. His eyes traveled once more over Daniel's stance, and the answer seemed to come to him without another word being spoken. They both stepped back at nearly the same time, their movement small but telling. No sudden retreat, no sprint into the night. Just a careful withdrawal of men who had decided, in a split second, that this was not worth whatever trouble it might bring. And in that subtle shift, the threat began to dissolve, replaced by the heavy quiet of a standoff that had already been decided without a single physical move. Daniel moved forward with a kind of deliberate pace that made each step feel heavier than the last. It wasn't a march, and it wasn't a rush. It was a careful advance of a man who knew exactly how much space to close before his presence spoke louder than anything he could say. The lamplight stretched his shadow across the cracked sidewalk, reaching almost to the shoes of the two men. His eyes stayed fixed on them, not in anger, but in a way that measured and assessed, as if he were cataloging every twitch of muscle, every flicker in their gaze. When he spoke, his voice was still even, almost courteous, but there was no mistaking precision in it. Each word was placed as though it had been weighed beforehand, chosen for the exact effect it would have. He didn't need volume to make it cut through the night. The discipline in his delivery was enough. "Gentlemen," he began, the single word carrying the bearer's suggestion and command, "this isn't the place for whatever you think you're doing." There was no insult in it, no raised tone, nothing to invite argument, and that made it harder to respond to. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement of fact, laid out plainly, with a kind of finality that left little room for discussion. The taller of the two opened his mouth as if to answer, but stopped, glancing at his friend first. That pause, that moment of checking for agreement, was exactly the sort of hesitation Daniel was trained to see. He took another step forward. It brought him close enough that they could see the fine lines around his eyes, the faint scar above his right eyebrow, the weathering of someone who had lived more than one lifetime's worth of moments like this. His hands remained loose, but there was a coiled readiness in his posture, the kind that suggested any sudden movement from them would be met instantly. "Walk away," he continued, the same level tone, no faster and no slower than before. The words didn't plead, didn't threaten. They simply carried an expectation, the kind of expectation that came from a man used to giving orders that were followed. The shorter man's jaw worked, as though he were chewing over the possibility of holding his ground. But every part of Daniel's presence contradicted the idea that this was a contest he could win. It wasn't brute size or loud bravado that gave Daniel the advantage. It was the way he occupied the space between them with such absolute steadiness, leaving no gaps for uncertainty to creep in. Margaret didn't speak, didn't even shift her weight. She knew exactly what he was doing, the same way she'd seen him handle tense moments at the VFW when arguments threatened to spill into fights. He never rushed to fill the silence. He let it work for him, let the other side feel the weight of it until they either stepped back or broke under it. The taller man's eyes flickered again over Daniel's frame. The squared shoulders, the relaxed but ready stance, the eyes that didn't look away even once. This wasn't a man bluffing his way through a confrontation. This was someone who had lived enough of them to know exactly how they ended when handled correctly. Daniel's final step brought him just inside the invisible boundary, where distance becomes personal. He didn't move aggressively, but the air between them shifted, charged with the certainty of what would happen if they made the wrong choice. His voice, still polite, carried one more phrase, each syllable deliberate. "It's time to go." And in those few words, and the quiet control with which they were spoken, the outcome was already decided. The taller of the two broke the silence first, his voice carrying a note that was meant to sound casual, but didn't quite make it there. A short, choppy laugh escaped him, the kind that betrayed more nerves and humor. "Hey, we were just talking," he said, his tone trying to bridge the gap between dismissal and self-defense. The words floated in the air for a second too long, as if even he knew they didn't land the way he intended. Daniel didn't answer right away. He simply stood, letting the man's attempt hang there without the comfort of a quick response. That pause was deliberate. It gave the statement room to show its cracks. Margaret, still perfectly still, noticed how the taller one's eyes shifted away almost immediately after speaking, scanning the street as though suddenly interested in anything that wasn't Daniel's face. The shorter one gave a little shrug, trying to match the casual front his friend had attempted. His weight shifted back slightly, the heel of his sneakers squeaking against the concrete. "Yeah, no harm done," he added, his voice softer, but the edge in it was gone. Whatever energy they'd started would have been drained by the quiet authority standing in front of them. Daniel's eyes didn't waver. The silence between them stretched again, heavy and unbroken, until the taller man's smirk faltered. Nervous laughter only worked if the other party gave it something to bounce off of, some acknowledgement to show they believed it. Without that, it became obvious for what it was, a mask that didn't fit. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low and even. Talking doesn't usually involve blocking someone's way. There was nothing accusatory in his tone, just a statement. But it was clear there was no room for argument in it. The taller man let out another short breath that was almost a chuckle, but not quite. His eyes flicked toward Margaret, then back to Daniel, as if searching for some sign that this could be brushed aside. The sound of a car turning onto the far end of Pine Street drew their attention for a moment, headlights cutting across the damp pavement. The car slowed at a stop sign, and then rolled past without slowing further. It was enough of a break in the moment for the taller man to shift his stance again, turning slightly as though readying himself to leave without making it seem like retreat. "Look, man," he said finally, his voice lower now, "we didn't mean anything by it." The words lacked conviction, but they were the closest thing to an admission they were willing to give. The shorter one nodded faintly, still keeping his hands visible and his body angled slightly away. Daniel didn't step forward again, didn't need to. The balance had shifted entirely. He knew it, and they knew it. The polite patience in his eyes remained, but underneath it there was the unspoken message that he would not be moved by nervous smiles or flimsy explanations. The attempt to play it off had failed before it began, because the men standing in front of him weren't dealing with someone who needed to be convinced. Margaret kept her gaze steady, her hand still on her purse strap, her breathing calm. She recognized the rhythm of this kind of moment. Daniel was letting them find their own way out, giving them the choice to step back without forcing it, but not offering the comfort of thinking they had the upper hand. The taller one finally turned his head toward his friend, tilting it in the smallest gesture toward the street. The shorter one didn't argue. Without a word, they began to shift away from the ATM, their earlier posturing replaced with the awkward shuffle of men leaving a situation they no longer controlled. Their laughter, so quick to appear before, didn't follow them as they moved off into the night. The only sound left was a quiet tap of their footsteps fading into the distance. Margaret's fingers curled more firmly around the strap of her worn leather purse, the supple material creasing under her grip. It wasn't fear that made her tighten her hold. Not anymore. It was the awareness that the balance had shifted in a way she could feel without seeing. The moment Daniel had stepped into the space between her and the two men, something fundamental had changed. She could read it in the way their bodies no longer faced her directly, in the subtle adjustments of their shoulders and feet. The confidence they had carried when they crossed the street toward her had dissolved into something looser, less certain. Daniel didn't have to raise his voice or move suddenly. His very presence was a kind of quiet anchor, pulling the entire scene into his orbit. Her pulse, which had been steady by force of will, found a calmer rhythm. She knew this about him. It had been true from the first years of their marriage, when he'd step into tense situations without hesitation. Whether it was a loud neighbor dispute or a stranger's drunken anger at the VFW, Daniel never rushed, never fumbled. He moved with deliberate steadiness, as though each step was already mapped out in his mind before his boot hit the ground. Margaret's mind drifted for just a second to all the times she'd seen him command a room without shouting, without waving his arms, without ever giving the impression that he was trying to dominate anyone. It was the way he stood, the way his eyes locked and held, the way he gave people just enough silence to feel the weight of their own words. That was happening now, and she could feel it in her bones. He had them. The taller man shifted on his feet, one hand disappearing briefly into his hoodie pocket before coming back out to adjust the brim of his cap. His friend glanced toward the far end of the street, the unlit shop fronts and the slow flicker of a single lamppost offering no distraction from the tension between them. The forced laughter from moments earlier was gone, replaced by the faint sound of shuffling sneakers against concrete. Margaret didn't speak. She didn't need to. This was no longer her interaction to manage. She could see that Daniel had moved them onto his ground, where every unspoken rule worked in his favor. She simply kept her place, a steady figure by the ATM, holding herself upright not because she had to, but because she wanted to stand as she always had when he was near, unmoved. Her eyes followed him as he angled himself slightly, positioning his body so they couldn't edge around him without stepping into his space. He hadn't touched them, hadn't raised a hand, but the message was clear. Any path away from this moment was one he controlled. She could see his shoulders, broad but relaxed, a posture that spoke of someone used to containing situations before they spun out of control. The two men, once leaning in toward her, now stood angled out, their energy folding inward. They weren't retreating outright, but they weren't advancing either. The taller one rubbed his jaw, glancing sidelong at his companion, as if silently asking how far they were willing to push this. His friend gave the smallest shake of his head, almost imperceptible, but enough to be noticed by anyone paying attention. Margaret knew the signs well. She had seen Daniel dismantle someone's resolve without raising his voice or taking a single aggressive step. It was always in the way he occupied a moment so fully that the other person's choices seemed to shrink until there was only one reasonable one left. Her hand stayed tight on the strap of her purse, but now it was less about guarding it and more about grounding herself in the gravity of the moment. She understood, without words, that they were past the point of danger. They were in the stage where the other side realized they had lost the initiative but hadn't yet decided how to leave. Daniel was in control now, and control meant safety. The street was quiet except for the low hum of the ATM behind her and the faint rustle of leaves down the block. Even that seemed to underscore the shift. Where moments before her senses had been tuned to every small sound, now they settled on him, his measured breathing, the way his boots rested firmly on the ground, the faint creak of his leather jacket as he adjusted his stance. Margaret's grip didn't loosen, but her shoulders did, not because the situation had ended, but because she trusted the way Daniel finished what he started. Whatever these men decided, it would happen on his terms. And in that knowledge, she found a kind of stillness that came only when you knew the outcome was no longer in question. Daniel didn't move closer, didn't raise his voice, but the weight in his words was enough to change the air between them. "You should walk away," he said, each syllable deliberate, "before you regret staying." It wasn't a threat in the loud, posturing sense that young men sometimes toss around. It was quieter, more certain, like a door quietly closing on the only way out before things turned. The taller man's jaw twitched. For a moment, His expression flickered with something that might have been irritation, but it didn't last. He glanced toward his friend, a quick, sharp look that carried an unspoken question. Are we actually doing this? The other man avoided answering directly, his eyes dropping to the ground for just a moment before flicking back up toward Daniel. Margaret recognized that look. She'd seen it before, in different decades, in different men, moments when bluster collided with the immovable wall of someone who meant exactly what they said. Daniel wasn't leaning into them, wasn't making fists, wasn't puffing up his chest, but it made the outcome plain. There was no scenario in which staying here would end the way they wanted. The shorter one tried to mask the shift with a little shrug, the kind meant to say this isn't worth it, without actually admitting defeat. He shifted his stance, so he was angled slightly away from both Margaret and Daniel, as if his body had already decided the direction it would take when they left. The taller one, slower to accept it, kept his eyes on Daniel a second longer. He seemed to be measuring him, maybe looking for a sign that there was room to push back. There wasn't. Daniel didn't fill the silence with more words. He knew the fewer he spoke, the heavier they landed. His posture stayed steady, shoulders square, feet planted, chin level. Margaret could see the years of service in that stance, the unshakable presence of someone who had been trained to control not just his body, but the space around him. He wasn't trying to provoke. He was making it clear that the decision now belonged to them, but so would the consequences. A breeze moved through Pine Street, stirring the fallen leaves near the curb. It carried the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere a few blocks away, mixing with the sharper scent of cold metal from the ATM behind her. In the distance, a car engine started, then faded as it turned down another street. The sound seemed louder in the stillness, as if the rest of the world was giving this moment room to play out. The taller man broke eye contact first. It was quick, just a glance toward the sidewalk to his right. But it was enough. That small crack in his stance was all that was needed to tip the balance further. His friend gave another slight nod, subtle but firm this time, and the taller one exhaled through his nose, a sound halfway between frustration and resignation. You know what, man? Fine, the tall one said, his voice lower now, stripped of the forced humor from earlier. We're going. Daniel didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't soften. He let the words stand, offering no visible reaction that might let them reclaim a sense of control over their exit. The two men stepped back in near unison, giving a wide enough berth to avoid brushing against either of them. They moved with the restless energy of people who didn't want to look like they were retreating, even as every step took them further away. Margaret kept her eyes on Daniel as they left, noting the way his gaze followed them until they had crossed back over the street. Only then did he shift slightly, his shoulders easing just a fraction, though his attention didn't leave them until they had turned down the block and disappeared from view. The hum of the ATM filled the quiet again, steady and impersonal, as if it hadn't just been the backdrop to a confrontation. Margaret's fingers relaxed slightly on her purse strap, though she didn't move from her spot yet. Daniel's words still hung in the air for her, not as a threat, but as a kind of unvarnished truth that closed the door on any thought of testing him. It was the kind of warning that didn't need repeating, the kind that stayed with a person long after they'd walked away. The shorter man had already started angling his body away, his shoulders dipping in that slow, reluctant acknowledgement of defeat, when his eyes caught something he hadn't noticed before. The streetlight above them flickered once, casting a brief shadow over Daniel's chest before flaring back on. In that moment of clarity, the emblem stood out, subtle, stitched into the leather of his jacket. The gold and crimson glint of the eagle, globe, and anchor. The younger man's gaze fixed on it, and something shifted in his face. The smirk he had been holding on to, thin as it was, faded into a flatter, more guarded expression. His jaw tightened slightly, as if he was working through what that emblem meant and why it suddenly felt heavier than the man wearing it had already made it. His eyes flicked up to Daniel's again, but there was no trace of defiance now. Only the cautious respect that comes from recognizing a certain kind of authority, the kind that doesn't come from a badge or a uniform alone. Margaret caught the change. She had seen it before, on younger men who thought they were in control until they realized they weren't. It wasn't fear exactly, but an understanding that they were standing in front of someone who had lived through things they hadn't imagined. Someone who knew what it meant to hold a line, and who had the skill to do it without hesitation. The younger man's friend didn't seem to notice at first. He was still scanning the street, looking for a way to leave without making it obvious they were backing down. But the younger one reached out and lightly touched his arm, just enough to get his attention. His eyes darted toward the emblem, and then back to his friend's face, a silent message passing between them. The taller man's gaze followed, and when he saw it, his own posture shifted. Not as dramatically. His pride made sure of that, but the straightness in his stance softened, his chin dropped half an inch, and the tension in his hands eased. Neither of them said the words aloud, but Margaret could almost hear the thought. He's a Marine. Daniel didn't acknowledge that they'd noticed. He didn't point to the emblem, didn't mention his service, didn't need to. He simply stood there, the weight of his presence now doubled by the history stitched into his jacket. Years in uniform, decades since active duty, yet still carried the same unspoken warning. The younger man's eyes dropped to the ground for a moment. Then he let out a breath that wasn't quite a sigh, but carried something like acceptance in it. He gave a quick nod, barely there, almost as if he was nodding to himself rather than to Daniel, and murmured something to his friend that Margaret couldn't catch. Whatever it was, it got them both moving again, this time without the dragging reluctance they had before. Margaret felt the last thread of danger loosen. She knew the emblem's effect wasn't just in its design, but in what it signified to those who understood it. It wasn't just a reminder of military service. It was a declaration of endurance, of training, of discipline so ingrained it couldn't be faked. Those young men didn't know Daniel's full history, but they didn't have to. The symbol alone told enough of the story. As they stepped back onto the opposite curb, the taller one glanced over his shoulder once more. Not at her, but at Daniel. It wasn't a glare, and it wasn't curiosity. It was something quieter, more measuring. Then he turned away for good, the two of them melting into the dim street until their outlines were swallowed by shadow. Daniel stood still for a few seconds longer, his breathing steady, his gaze lingering on the direction they'd gone. Margaret could tell he was giving them the chance to be fully gone before letting the moment close. When he finally looked back at her, the hard edge in his eyes had softened, though the readiness in his posture hadn't yet eased. She shifted her purse on her shoulder and took in the sight of him there under the streetlight, the emblem catching a glint of gold as he moved. It struck her again how that small piece of stitching could carry so much weight, could change the course of an encounter without a single additional word. And from a look on the younger man's face before he left, Margaret knew that, for the rest of the night, that emblem would stay with him, quietly reminding him that some people were not to be mistaken for easy marks. The taller man's eyes lingered on Daniel for a fraction longer than necessary, as though weighing some last stubborn impulse against the reality in front of him. His friend gave the smallest tilt of his head toward the far end of the street, a silent suggestion that this was done. Whatever words passed between them were low enough to be swallowed by the stillness, just the barest murmur carried on the cool air. Margaret couldn't catch the syllables, but she didn't need to. The tone said enough. The taller one exhaled sharply through his nose, a quick sound of frustration, but it was paired with a step backward. His weight shifted off the ball of his foot, his body turning slightly away, and then the younger one followed, angling himself so that Daniel was no longer directly in his path. It was retreat disguised as a casual move, but they both knew there was nothing casual about it. Daniel didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't soften his stance. His silence was its own pressure, an invisible force urging him farther away. The taller man glanced over his shoulder at the empty sidewalk, then at his friend, as if hoping for some shared acknowledgement that they could leave now without losing too much face. The younger one gave a quick shrug, half impatience, half agreement, and that seemed to settle it. They began to move in the same direction, steps in sync, but unhurried, trying to stretch the moment so it looked like they were leaving because they wanted to, not because they were made to. The pretense was thin. Margaret could read the shift in their shoulders, the way their eyes no longer sought hers, the subtle collapse of the false bravado that had been there only minutes before. The sound of their sneakers scuffing against the cracked pavement seemed louder than it should have in the otherwise quiet street. A lamppost at the far end flickered once, casting their shadows long and distorted across the sidewalk. For a brief moment, Margaret saw them not as looming figures at her back, but as two young men walking away into a kind of uncertainty they hadn't anticipated when they crossed the street toward her. They didn't look back right away. It was only when they reached the corner, where the light from Pine Street faded into the dim orange of another block, that the taller one cast a final glance over his shoulder. His gaze wasn't defiant anymore. It was searching, measuring Daniel one last time. The younger one didn't bother. He kept walking, hands buried in his hoodie pocket, head angled down just enough to suggest he'd had enough of the encounter. When they stepped out of the light and into the shadows beyond, their outlines blurred and then disappeared entirely. The sound of their footsteps grew faint, then faded altogether. The street swallowed them up, leaving only the distant hum of traffic blocks away and the low mechanical rhythm of the ATM behind Margaret. For a moment, neither she nor Daniel moved. He kept his eyes fixed in the direction they'd gone, as if listening for any sign they might double back. His shoulders remained squared, his weight evenly balanced, a stance he could hold for as long as needed. Margaret waited, feeling the knot in her chest slowly begin to loosen, her grip on her purse strap easing a fraction. Finally, Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that releases tension without drawing attention to it. He looked back at her, and in the pool of light from the nearest lamppost, she could see the shift in his expression. The hard focus was still there, but it was softened now, grounded by something warmer. Recognition, reassurance, the silent exchange that passed between them after years of knowing exactly how the other thought. The space between them felt different without the two men occupying it. The air seemed lighter, though the night still held its edge. Margaret glanced down the street once more, half expecting to see movement in the shadows. But there was nothing, just a quiet stretch of sidewalk, the flicker of the lamp above, and the muted hum of the machines behind her. The moment had ended, but it hadn't dissolved entirely. Some part of it lingered, stitched into the silence like a reminder that danger can pass without fanfare, that retreat can happen without anyone naming it for what it is. The two men had chosen to vanish into the dark, and in doing so, they'd left behind the simple truth Daniel had made clear from the moment he stepped forward. Some ground cannot be taken, and some people cannot be moved. For a long moment after the two figures dissolved into the darkness, Margaret remained exactly where she was, as if her body hadn't yet received permission to move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the corner they had turned, waiting for some sign they might reappear. The quiet of the street pressed in from all sides, and in that stillness, she became aware of the sound of her own breathing, shallow, tight, as though she'd been holding it without realizing. It was a slow, steady presence beside her that broke the tension. Daniel didn't touch her right away, didn't rush to ask if she was all right. He simply stood there, facing the direction they had gone, scanning it with the same patience she had seen 100 times before. There was something reassuring in the way he didn't move on too quickly, as if he were still guarding the space between them and the shadows. Only when his gaze shifted back to her did she feel her own focus change. She inhaled deeply, the first full breath she'd taken since the voice behind her shoulder had asked for her purse. The air felt cool and clean in her lungs, though there was a tremor in the way she released it. Her shoulders, which had been drawn up tight toward her neck, began to lower. The muscles in her back ached with a sudden awareness of just how rigid she had been standing. She loosened her grip on the purse strap, flexing her fingers once to shake out the stiffness. Her hand still remembered the instinctive clench, the need to hold on to something solid. It was only now, with Daniel's presence anchoring the moment, that she realized she hadn't been thinking about the money inside or the cards in her wallet. She had been holding on because giving it up would have meant giving them the satisfaction, and she had no intention of doing that, not in front of anyone, least of all herself. Her eyes met Daniel's, and she saw the faintest shift in his expression, a trace of warmth cutting through the marine stillness. He didn't smile, but there was a softness there that told her he had been watching for the exact moment when the fear would leave her posture. He knew it when he saw it. The street felt different now, not quite safe, but no longer hostile. A breeze stirred, rustling the last of the autumn leaves along the curb, and she realized she could hear again the distant hum of a car passing a block over, the faint buzz of the ATM light behind her, the small creak of the leather strap against her shoulder. Details that had vanished under the rush of adrenaline returned, reminding her she was still here, still standing, still herself. Daniel finally stepped a little closer, his hand resting lightly at her elbow. not to guide her, but to mark the shift from defense to departure. "Let's go," he said quietly, and though his voice was low, it carried the same certainty as when he'd first spoken to the men. She nodded, feeling another wave of air leave her chest. As they turned away from the ATM, her steps were small at first, each one breaking the hold the moment had on her. The night was still cool, the streets still dim, but the oppressive sense of being trapped had ebbed. With every step, the stiffness in her spine eased a little more. By the time they reached the corner, the tension had retreated to a memory, sharp, but no longer consuming. Margaret let herself glance back just once, not in fear but in acknowledgement. The space was empty now, just cracked pavement under a streetlight, as if nothing had happened at all. But she knew better. That emptiness was earned, and the air filling her lungs again was the proof. Daniel's hand found her forearm with the ease of a habit formed over decades, his grip neither forceful nor tentative. Simply there, solid, guiding. Margaret didn't resist. The night air felt colder now that the rush of adrenaline had begun to fade, and the warmth of his palm was a quiet anchor as they stepped away from the glow of the ATM. The pavement underfoot was uneven, scattered with brittle leaves that crackled softly beneath their shoes. She noticed the sound more than she might have on any other evening, each crunch a reminder that the moment behind them was real and already receding. They moved in unhurried rhythm, Daniel setting a pace that matched her stride, not his own. He was still scanning their surroundings, his eyes shifting from the deep shadows between parked cars to the corners of darkened storefronts, but he kept his focus subtle. It was the same way he used to walk her home from the diner in their early years together, alert without announcing it, careful without making her feel watched over. That blend of vigilance and familiarity was part of why she'd never doubted him in all their years. The wind had picked up slightly, lifting the edge of her scarf and carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere down the block. A street lamp hummed overhead, its light catching the silver in Daniel's hair as they passed beneath it. She glanced at him then, seeing the hard lines in his face softened by the shadows, but the set of his jaw told her he hadn't fully let go of the encounter. His steps were measured, but there was still a readiness in the way he carried himself, as though he expected one of those men to step out from a side street at any moment. Margaret tightened her grip on his arm, not because she was unsteady, but because the physical connection steadied something deeper. She thought about the long years between their first meeting and this quiet walk now. How many times he'd been the one to see danger before she had, to step between her and whatever trouble threatened. But she also remembered the times he let her stand on her own, trusting she could manage it. Tonight had been a little of both. She had held her ground when she needed to, and he had arrived when the balance began to tilt. They passed the old hardware store, its front window dark, a hand painted closed, sign swinging faintly in the breeze. The street was quiet enough that the only other movement came from a cat darting out from between two houses, slipping across their path before disappearing again. It reminded her how still their town could be at night, how empty streets could feel welcoming or dangerous depending on what just happened on them. Daniel's thumb brushed lightly against her sleeve, a barely noticeable gesture, but one she recognized as deliberate. It was the unspoken reassurance that they were almost home, that whatever tension still lingered in their muscles could be released soon. She could see the faint glow of their porch light now, warm and steady at the far end of the block. The sight of it loosened something in her chest she hadn't realized was still tight. They didn't speak much on the way, and there was no need to. Their silence was filled with the quiet rhythm of their footsteps and the shared understanding that they'd both been exactly where they needed to be in that moment at the ATM. When they reached the corner before their street, Daniel finally glanced sideways at her, his expression softer now, and she returned it with a small nod. The last stretch toward home felt easier. The shadows grew less heavy, the air warmer, as though the small boundary of their neighborhood had its own way of protecting them. By the time they stepped onto their walkway, Margaret could feel the weight of the night settling into the past. Daniel's hand was still on her arm, steady and sure, as he guided her up the steps toward the door. Neither of them hurried. There was no need to any more. The sound of their footsteps on the sidewalk seemed to blend with another rhythm in Margaret's mind, one she hadn't consciously thought about in years. The slow tick of the clock in their old living room during the long nights he was away. It had been a different kind of quiet back then, heavier, with the weight of the unknown pressing in from all sides. She remembered sitting by the radio, tuning through stations without hearing a single note of music or word of news that could ease the worry. Every distant siren, every unexpected knock at the door, had been enough to set her heart pounding in her throat. When Daniel was deployed, the days had felt like they were carved into small, endless pieces. She would go through the motions, work, errands, church on Sundays, smiling when people asked how she was, nodding when it told her to stay strong. But the nights were her undoing. The house would settle into its familiar creaks, and she would lie awake in the dark, listening for something she couldn't name, afraid that the next letter might not come, or that it would be delivered not in his handwriting, but in an official envelope. She could still see the stacks of envelopes he had sent, each one with its corners worn soft from her opening and closing them again and again. His words were careful, never detailing more than he was allowed, but she learned to read between the lines. A simple, "I'm fine," might mean he was far from it. A sentence about the weather could hold the weight of an entire week's worth of unspoken events. She would write back the same way, carefully, steadily, giving him the comfort of the ordinary, because she knew he needed to picture home as unchanged, waiting for him. There had been months when letters slowed to a trickle, when she'd go to the mailbox and find nothing but bills and circulars, and the silence would stretch so long she'd start imagining the worst. Those were the nights she would sit at the kitchen table, tracing the rim of her coffee cup, staring at the empty chair across from her. The space he left behind was not just physical. It was woven into every part of her life. She had learned to live with it, to keep moving forward without knowing if he would ever walk to the door again. When he finally did come home after each deployment, there was always a moment of dissonance. She would see him standing there in uniform, looking so much the same, and yet carrying something new in his eyes, something that didn't belong to civilian life. She never pressed him to explain it. Instead, she learned to be patient, to let him fold back into the rhythm of their shared days at his own pace. And with time, the shadows in his gaze would fade, replaced by the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Now, walking beside him under the dim streetlights, she felt the thread between those years and this night. The worry had been different at the ATM, sudden and sharp instead of drawn out and gnawing, but the core was the same. The fear of losing him, of being alone against something she couldn't stop. And just as before, he'd come back to her, this time not from a distant desert or an unnamed base, but from half a block away, in time to stand between her and danger. She glanced up at him, at the steady set of his shoulders, and thought of all the nights she had prayed for that sight. He had returned to her then, and he had returned again tonight. The years between had taught her the same lesson over and over, that no matter the distance, no matter the darkness, Daniel always found his way back. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Pine Street looked the way it always did. The air was crisp and clear, the kind that sharpened the outlines of buildings and made the sky seem just a little more blue than usual. The bank's glass doors reflected the light, erasing any trace of the shadows that had gathered there the night before. Margaret stood at her kitchen window with her coffee, watching the quiet bustle begin. The delivery truck backing into the alley behind the bakery, the florist unlocking her shop, the man from the hardware store sweeping the sidewalk out front. It struck her how unchanged it all appeared, as though the world had chosen to keep moving without noticing what had happened in its margins. By mid-morning, the bank's ATM would be in steady use again. People would step up with their cards, eyes on the screen, thinking about weekend errands or what to make for dinner. No one would look over their shoulder twice. No one would think about the way the lamppost on the corner cast such long shadows at night. The young woman depositing her paycheck, the retired man withdrawing cash for groceries. None of them would sense the shape of two strangers leaning against a bus shelter, watching. None of them would picture the quiet stillness when those same strangers had stepped across the street. In the cafe across from the bank, the tables were already filling with regulars. Someone laughed loud enough to be heard through the open door, the sound spilling onto the sidewalk like nothing bad had ever lingered there. The barista smiled at each customer, calling them by name, pouring coffee as though the evening hours belonged to another world entirely. To the people chatting over muffins or reading the paper, Pine Street was just Pine Street, as dependable as the sunrise. Margaret knew that if she would tell someone about what had happened, they might frown and nod politely, but the weight of it wouldn't land. In the daylight, danger always seemed more abstract, like something that belonged to news stories from somewhere else. She understood that now more than ever, how easily the edges of fear could be smoothed away by a morning's brightness. It wasn't malice or indifference. It was simply the nature of a small town to turn its gaze toward the ordinary and let the unspoken moments fade. At the market, she passed a woman she'd known for years, someone who always stopped to ask about her garden. Today, they spoke about the chrysanthemums and how the cold snap might come sooner this year. There was no pause, no flicker of suspicion that just 12 hours earlier, Margaret had stood with her back to a cold brick wall, while two young men blocked her way. She found herself nodding, smiling, as if she had not spent part last night weighing her options in the space between their words and their eyes. Daniel, she knew, wouldn't speak of it unless necessary. He had always been that way, carrying things quietly once they were over. This was no different. To anyone watching him walk to the VFW that evening, he would look the same as he had the day before, steady gait, familiar jacket, a nod of greeting to those he passed. No one would see the way his mind replayed the scene, measuring how close it had come to ending differently. The truth of it settled in Margaret as she moved through her morning. What had happened wasn't erased, but it also wasn't visible. It existed in a narrow slice of time between when the ATM's motor hummed and when Daniel's voice cut the air. Outside that window, the town went on untouched. People laughed. Cars rolled down Main Street. The bakery smell drifted on the wind. Life, in its quiet way, had chosen not to notice. And so, Margaret carried the knowledge alone, with only Daniel sharing the weight of what might have been. They didn't speak of it right away. The morning had passed quietly, each of them moving through familiar motions, Margaret tidying the kitchen, Daniel stepping out to check the mailbox and bring in the newspaper. It wasn't until the afternoon, when the sun had begun to lower and they found themselves sitting together at the small table by the window, that he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the wood, and broke the silence. His voice was steady, the kind of steady that came from years of saying difficult things without dramatics. He told her he had seen their hands before she even knew they were close enough to touch her. One, he said, was loose but angled just so, ready to snatch the strap of her purse the moment her attention shifted. The other, curled tight, not like someone simply standing at ease, but like someone already rehearsing the first strike. Margaret felt her fingers trace the seam of her coffee cup without realizing it. She could picture it now, the way he described, the subtle, dangerous readiness in her posture, how even in stillness the body can give away its intent. She thought back to the sensation she'd had when the one in front of her stepped closer, not quite touching, but close enough that the air felt heavier. She had noticed his eyes first, then the way his shoulders were set, but not his hands. Not then. Daniel told her it was the hands that always told the truth. In his experience, words could be anything, a distraction, a bluff, a deliberate lie, but the hands betrayed what someone meant to do. He had seen it overseas more times than he could count. The flicker of a movement before a weapon was drawn, the tightening of fingers on a trigger, the unconscious curl into a fist. It was the kind of detail that became instinct to watch for, because the moment you stopped noticing was the moment you could lose your life. She listened without interrupting, letting him speak the way she knew he needed to. He explained how from half a block away, even before he recognized her silhouette, he'd caught sight of that fist and the angle of that other hand. It wasn't a casual stance of someone passing time. It was coiled, calculated. And in that instant, he said, the world narrowed. The distance between him and her wasn't measured in steps anymore, but in seconds, each one a chance for something to go wrong if he didn't close it fast enough. Margaret found herself wondering how many times he'd done this before. Not for her, but for others, in places she would never see, under circumstances she would never fully know. She thought about the years when he had been gone, when every day she hoped he was watching just as closely, ready to step in if someone made the wrong move. The idea that those same instincts had followed him home, into their quiet town, was both unsettling and deeply comforting. He didn't dwell on what could have happened. That wasn't his way. Instead, he spoke in the same calm, deliberate tone, as if laying out a set of instructions for her to keep in mind. Always know where the exits are. Keep your eyes on their hands, not just their faces. Don't let someone crowd your space without making them step back. She nodded, not because she hadn't heard these things before, but because this time the lesson carried the weight of the night before. When he finally leaned back in his chair, the conversation settled into a silence that felt less like an ending and more like an understanding. They both knew the details of what had almost been, even if the rest of the town never would. It was knowledge they would carry between them, wordless but permanent, a reminder of the thin line between the ordinary and the moment everything could change. Daniel had walked home from the VFW hundreds of times, his route so familiar it was almost muscle memory. Most nights he took Maple Avenue, the longer but better lit path that wound past the post office and a row of small shops still holding on to their neon signs. It was a kind of route that let him nod to a few late-working neighbors, maybe pause at the bakery window to see if they had tomorrow's bread cooling on the racks. But that night, he had stopped at the corner, his hand in the pocket of his jacket, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain, his feet didn't turn toward Maple. They angled left toward Pine Street. It wasn't a shortcut. If anything, it shaved maybe a minute off his walk. Pine was quieter, narrower, a place most people avoided after dark because the street lamps were spaced too far apart and half of them flickered like they were on their last hours. Daniel didn't avoid places like that, never had, but he also didn't make a habit of them when there was no reason. Still, something in him pressed for it that night. It was the same feeling he'd learned to trust years ago, the one that didn't shout but spoke firmly enough to make him change course without hesitation. The air was cooler on Pine. He could smell damp leaves underfoot and hear the faint hum of the transformer on the pole near the corner. His pace was steady, not hurried, but his eyes moved in small, deliberate sweeps the way they always did when he was in shadow places. The habit wasn't conscious anymore. It was built into him. That's when he caught the shape of the bus shelter up ahead, two figures leaning in that way young men do when they think no one's watching. He didn't know who they were, didn't recognize their faces, but there was something in their posture that made him pay attention. They weren't waiting for a bus. That much was clear. People waiting for a ride shifted their weight now and then, glanced up the street, checked their phones. These two stood still, heads tilted slightly in the same direction. Daniel followed the invisible line their gaze was drawing and saw a smaller shape moving toward the ATM. Even from a distance, he knew it was her. There was no mistaking Margaret's way of carrying herself. Upright but without hurry, each step measured. She had her purse at her side, her coat collar turned up against the wind. He felt his body respond before his thoughts caught up, that small pull in his chest, that tightening across his shoulders. It wasn't just recognition. It was a quiet jolt of knowing he'd been right to take this street tonight. Later, when she asked him about it, he wouldn't try to explain it as luck. He didn't believe in luck, not in the way most people did. He called it paying attention to things you can't quite see, but can feel if you're willing to notice. In his years in the Marines, there had been times when that feeling had kept him alive. It was never about certainty. It was about knowing when not to ignore the small shift in the air, the sense that you're meant to be exactly where you are. If he'd taken Maple, he told her, they might have been gone before he reached home, or worse, still there at the moment, already gone too far to pull back. That thought sat heavy with him. He didn't say it to scare her, but because it was true. Sometimes it didn't take skill or force to change the outcome. It took showing up at the exact right second. So he'd keep listening to that quiet pull, even on nights when the streets were empty and nothing seemed out of place. Because once in a while, it wasn't just a walk home. It was the difference between arriving to find nothing amiss and arriving in time to make sure of it. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink the next morning, rinsing out a teacup, her thoughts drifting back to the night before. The sunlight was warm through the window, catching the edges of the curtains and casting soft, shifting shapes across the counter. Outside, it was a perfectly ordinary day, the kind that would give no hint that anything unusual had happened less than 12 hours ago. But beneath the quiet, she carried a weight of realization that settled deeper with each passing minute. Daniel had not changed, not in the ways that truly mattered. It wasn't just that he had stepped in when those men closed around her. It was the way he had done it, without hesitation, without a flicker of doubt or calculation. She had seen in his stride as he approached, in the calm but commanding tone of his voice, in the way his eyes never left theirs until they backed away. There had been no moment where he looked to see if anyone else would act, no pause to measure whether he should intervene. To Daniel, there had only been one possible move, and it was to put himself between her and whatever threat there was. She thought back over their decades together and realized this wasn't something born out of that single night. It was a quiet thread running through every year, every place they had lived, every situation that had asked for more than comfort. In the early years, it was subtle, walking her to the car after late shifts, choosing a seat in a restaurant where he could see the door, noticing when someone lingered too long near their table. At the time, she thought of these as habits from his service years, things that would fade with civilian life. But they hadn't. If anything, they had become part of who he was. Margaret set the cup in the drying rack and leaned on the counter, letting the thoughts settle. His readiness wasn't performance. It wasn't something he put on to make her feel safe. It was instinct, carried like a second skin, one he never shed. And it wasn't just for her. She knew that. She'd seen him stop to help strangers without being asked, step into situations most people would walk away from. But there was something different when it came to her, a certain absolute in his movements, a refusal to allow harm to come close enough to touch her. She wondered if he even thought of it in those terms, or if it was simply what he believed marriage meant, to keep each other standing when the moment called for it. For her part, she had long understood that Daniel moved through the world with a kind of alertness most people couldn't see. He didn't announce it, didn't make speeches about it, and yet it was there in every unspoken decision, like the one that had led him down Pine Street instead of Maple. Last night had shown her something she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years. Time might have slowed him in some ways, might have added silver to his hair and lines to his face, but it hadn't touched the core of him. When danger appeared, Daniel didn't need to become someone else. He simply stepped forward as he always had. That certainty that he would still do so without a moment's pause wasn't dramatic or romantic in the way stories made it. It was steadier, heavier, the kind of truth that settled into the bones. She dried her hands, glanced toward the living room where he sat reading the paper, and felt a quiet swell of gratitude she didn't put into words. He would never expect her to. Some things, she knew, didn't need to be spoken aloud. The world might never see the way he moved through it, always watching, always ready. But she did, and that was enough.